The smell hit me before I even got through the double doors. Not sterile, like I expected. It was sweet, like overripe fruit, but underneath that, something metallic. Not blood exactly, more like old plumbing. Irene at the front desk barely glanced up when I showed her my ID. She just pointed a thumb at a hallway and said, "Back that way. Walt will get you settled." No welcome, no good luck, just efficient. That was the first thing that felt off. The interview had been so friendly, all smiles and assurances about training. This felt like a processing center, not a healthcare facility. The center was older than I'd pictured. Not dilapidated, but institutional. The walls were a pale, washed-out green, the kind they used to think was calming. Rows of reclining chairs faced a bank of machines with clear plastic tubing snaking everywhere. Everything hummed not loudly, but a constant low thrum that settled in your teeth. The air was cool, almost damp. I pulled my jacket tighter. It wasn't the temperature I'd expected for late summer. Walt, a guy with a permanent 5 o'clock shadow and tired eyes, met me halfway down the hall. He didn't offer a handshake, just gestured towards a small workstation tucked between the dialysis stations and a supply closet. "Yours," he said, dropping a ring of keys onto the counter with a clatter. "Log everything. Any alarms, any machine errors, anything out of the ordinary, and read the checklist." He pointed to something laminated and mounted on the wall beside the monitor. "It's specific." I glanced at it, expecting standard safety protocols. It wasn't. 1. If a coworker doesn't appear for their shift and doesn't call, do not cover their station. Leave it empty and log the absence. Do not attempt to contact them. 2. In your first 2 weeks, do not arrive early or stay late. Work only your assigned hours. Come in, do the job, leave on time. 3. Use only the established routes between the north wing and the treatment floor. Do not take shortcuts through the service tunnels. 4. Do not touch the glass of any window, mirror, or reflective surface after 11 p.m. If a surface has a handprint already on it that you didn't make, cover it. 5. If you find an erased or overwritten entry in the log, note its location in your own entry. Do not attempt to read the original. Do not ask who wrote it. 6. Do not stop moving in the east corridor. If you need to review something, step into a room first. 7. Do not enter the records room for any reason. 8. After 11 p.m., ride the elevator facing away from the doors. Do not turn around until the doors open at your floor. 9. Do not ask the outgoing shift why they look the way they look. Take the keys, say the departure phrase. Begin your shift. I read it again. It felt like a prank. Someone's idea of a joke. Walt hadn't even cracked a smile. He was already halfway down the hall, shoulders slumped. Probably just a way to weed out people who couldn't follow directions, or maybe a weird attempt at team building, a test of adherence to protocol. I chuckled to myself. They'd really gone all in. The pay wasn't great, but it was steady. After everything with Sarah's surgery, the bills, they were relentless. We'd drained our savings, maxed out a credit card, and were still looking at over $100,000. Steady was good. Steady meant keeping a roof over our heads, keeping Sarah in physical therapy. I needed this job. I glanced around the workstation again. A computer, a phone, a logbook, a pen that was tethered to the counter with a coil. Every single thing felt intentional. And the smell. It hadn't gone away. I tried to identify it, separate the sweet from the metallic, but it just swirled together. A peculiar, unsettling combination. Walt stopped at the double doors. Without turning around, he said, "Shift begins now." Then he was gone. I stared at the keys in my hand. I didn't ask him why he looked like he hadn't slept in a week. I took the keys. I didn't ask. It was just awkward. I cleared my throat, feeling a little foolish. I sat down, opened the logbook, and wrote, 11:03 p.m., shift start. Walt departed. All systems appear nominal. Then I noticed something. A faint smear on the plastic cover of the logbook, right where my hand rested. It wasn't a smudge. It looked like a partial handprint, and it definitely wasn't mine. I instinctively pulled my hand back. The air felt colder somehow. I looked at the clock, 10:58 p.m. Still a while before 11. I reached for the pen again, but hesitated, my fingers hovering over the tether. I was making the rounds, checking the dialysis machines. Each one hummed with a quiet, insistent rhythm. The pumps cycled fluid through clear plastic tubing. It was a monotonous task, but someone had to do it. Each machine had a little digital display showing the patient's vitals, the flow rate, and the time remaining in their treatment. I'd started with the north wing, systematically working my way down the row, noting anything out of the ordinary. A slightly elevated blood pressure here, a minor fluctuation in conductivity there. Nothing major. Just the usual overnight adjustments. The machines smelled faintly of disinfectant and something else. A sterile sweetness I couldn't place. It wasn't unpleasant exactly, just off. Like someone had tried to mask a different smell with too much air freshener. I double-checked the central monitoring station, verifying the alarms were set correctly. Everything was green. Everything was as it should be. I was almost finished with the north wing when I noticed something. Station 7 was dark. The machine was off, the display blank. That wasn't right. Usually, even between patients, they left a machine running in standby. It conserved energy, I think, or maybe it was something to do with maintaining the internal pressure of the system. Whatever the reason, a dark station meant someone was missing. I checked the schedule taped to the wall. Winnie was assigned to Station 7 tonight. Winnie had been working here for years, a quiet woman who always had a thermos of chamomile tea. She never called out sick. Never. I glanced at the clock. It was 1:17 a.m. She was already an hour and 17 minutes late. I walked back to the workstation, a prickle of unease starting at the back of my neck. I scanned the incoming call log on the computer. Nothing. No calls from Winnie, no messages. I hesitated, then reached for the phone to call her directly. That's when it came back to me. The list. Walt's list, the first rule. If a coworker doesn't appear for their shift and doesn't call, do not cover their station. Leave it empty and log the absence. Do not attempt to contact them. It felt so absurd now. What kind of policy was that? It was actively detrimental. A patient needed dialysis. Leaving a station empty meant someone wasn't getting treatment. I told myself it was a liability thing. Maybe if you tried to cover for someone who was legitimately incapacitated, you'd be putting yourself at risk. Maybe it was a legal issue, something about unauthorized medical practice. I ran through scenarios, trying to justify the rule, to make it make sense. It was probably something tedious and bureaucratic, a well-intentioned but ultimately flawed attempt at covering all the bases. But the feeling didn't go away. It was a cold, stubborn knot in my stomach. I looked back at the dark Station 7. A patient was scheduled to start treatment there in 45 minutes. A patient who needed me to start their treatment. I sat down and opened the logbook. My hand felt heavy as I wrote. 1:23 a.m. Winnie, Station 7. No show, no contact. Station left empty. The pen felt strangely slick against the plastic cover. I wanted to add a note to explain the situation, to suggest calling a supervisor, but the rule was clear. Don't attempt to contact. Don't cover the station. I closed the logbook. The hum of the other machines seemed louder now, more insistent, almost accusatory. I walked back to the north wing, resuming my rounds, but my focus was gone. I kept picturing Winnie, wondering what could have happened had she been in an accident. Was she sick? Was something terrible happening, and I was just sitting here, following a ridiculous, heartless rule? As I passed Station 7 again, I noticed something I hadn't seen before, a small handwritten note taped to the machine. It wasn't a patient note. The handwriting was different. It simply said, "Cal, check flow rate." Cal was on the evening shift, the one before Walt. I hadn't seen him. I hadn't spoken to him. I hadn't even known he left a note. And now, with Winnie absent, that note felt like a question hanging in the air, unanswered and unsettling. I couldn't check the flow rate. The machine wasn't running, and I couldn't ask Cal, because Cal wasn't here and I wasn't supposed to ask anyone about anything. I was recalibrating the sodium monitors on stations 1 through 4. It was tedious work, mostly just adjusting the sensitivity and logging the baseline readings, old machines constantly drifting. They'd been installed in 1998 according to the faded sticker on the back of Station 3. I always checked those stickers, a weird habit I guess, just grounding myself in something concrete. Everything else felt so ephemeral, so off. The overnight was usually quiet. Just the rhythmic whoosh and click of the machines, the low hum of the ventilation. Tonight, it was particularly still. Even the hum seemed muted, as if the building itself was holding its breath. I finished with Station 4, double-checking the readings against the previous shift's logs. Everything was within acceptable parameters. Good. One less thing to worry about? I glanced at the clock. 2:47 a.m. Almost done with this round. I still had to check the reverse osmosis system and top off the disinfectant tanks. I was aiming to finish everything before 5, before Walt came on. I didn't mind Walt. He was just worn down. He'd been doing this job for 20 years, and it showed. He moved slowly, spoke softly, and always looked like he hadn't slept in a week. I noticed a small drip coming from the tubing on Station 1. Nothing major, just a slow, steady plink into the plastic collection tray. I grabbed a wrench from my tool bag and started loosening the fitting. It was stuck. I put a little more pressure on it and it still wouldn't budge. I needed a better wrench, a larger one. The one I needed was in the supply closet, at the far end of the north wing. I hesitated. It was almost 5. I could just leave it for Walt. But I hated leaving things unfinished. It felt disrespectful somehow. And if it got worse, it could cause a bigger problem, a leak that needed to be contained. I glanced at the clock again, 5:22, plenty of time. I could grab the wrench, fix the drip, and still be out of here by 5:30. A few extra minutes wouldn't hurt. Then I remembered what Walt had said, or rather, what I remembered of what Walt had said. The list. Something about new employees. Not arriving early, not staying late. Just coming in, doing the work, and leaving. It wasn't about time theft or anything like that. It was something else, a feeling of unease he hadn't quite articulated. He just said it was best to be careful. I dismissed it as the rambling of a man who'd spent too long surrounded by failing kidneys and flickering fluorescent lights. It was just a procedure, probably. A way to discourage overtime claims. I was already halfway down the hall when a smell hit me. Not the usual sterile scent of disinfectant and plastic, but something metallic. Not blood, not exactly. More like old copper or a battery left out in the rain. The smell was faint, but insistent, growing stronger as I approached the supply closet. It made the back of my throat feel tight. I stopped. The supply closet was dark. The single overhead light burned out months ago and no one had bothered to replace it. I reached out and flipped the light switch anyway, out of habit. Nothing. I pulled out my phone and switched on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating shelves stacked with boxes of gloves, syringes, tubing, and cleaning supplies. And then I saw it, a shadow just at the edge of my peripheral vision, a flicker of movement near the back of the closet. I swung the flashlight around, but there was nothing there, just shadows. I stood there for a moment, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. My skin felt clammy, and a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination. I was tired, stressed, and probably dehydrated. The smell was just the old pipes, the metallic tang of the building's plumbing. But the smell was getting stronger, and the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I quickly grabbed the wrench I needed, a heavy pipe wrench with a black rubber grip. I didn't bother looking for anything else. I just wanted to get out of there. I hurried back to Station 1, fixed the drip in under a minute, and logged the repair in the maintenance log. It was 5:31 when I locked the door behind me, the automatic lock clicking shut with a final, definitive sound. As I walked to my car, I kept glancing back at the dialysis center. The windows were dark and empty, reflecting the pre-dawn sky. I realized no other cars were in the lot, not a single one, and I hadn't seen another soul since starting my shift. I was the only one who knew I'd stayed late. I spent the next hour doing rounds, checking the machines, topping off saline solutions, making sure everything was running smoothly. It was quiet, as usual. The hum of the pumps and the gentle hiss of the dialysis process were the only sounds. I put on a playlist my wife, Sarah, made for me when she was recovering. It was all 80s music, The Cure, New Order, a lot of Depeche Mode. She knew it kept me focused. I kept the volume low, just enough to hear over the machines. Station 7 needed its blood leak detector recalibrated. It was a simple fix, a quick adjustment of the sensor. I pulled up the maintenance manual on my tablet, followed the steps, and within 10 minutes it was reading normal. I logged it, initialed, and dated the form. These little things, the routine checks, the minor repairs, they were the bulk of the job. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. And right now, steady was everything. Sarah's medical bills weren't going to pay themselves. After that, I started prepping the supply carts for the day shift. Restocking gloves, tubing, saline bags, cleaning solution. It was tedious work, but I tried to be meticulous. Rand, one of the day techs, was a stickler for organization. I remembered him complaining about the last overnight guy leaving things in a mess. I didn't want to start off on the wrong foot. That's when I noticed it. The shortcut. To get back to the central supply room, I usually had to walk all the way around to the main corridor, a 5-minute detour. But there was a door, a service access point, just around the corner from Station 7. I'd seen it before, but Walt had specifically mentioned avoiding unnecessary areas. Still, it would save me a good chunk of time, and honestly, it was just a door. I hesitated for maybe 10 seconds. It wasn't like it was locked or marked with warning signs, it was just not the usual route. I figured it was probably for maintenance access, for running cables or something. I pushed the door open. It led into a narrow hallway, barely wide enough for one person. The air was different in here, colder, and it smelled like dust and something else, something vaguely sweet, like old flowers. The floor was concrete, bare and worn. No carpet, no baseboards, just cold, gray concrete. I walked quickly, wanting to get back to the supply room and finish restocking the carts. The hallway ran parallel to the main corridor, but it felt disconnected. There were no windows, no doors, just a single flickering fluorescent light every 30 feet or so. And the silence. It wasn't the quiet of the dialysis floor, filled with the hum of machines. It was absolute oppressive silence. Then I realized I hadn't seen a single scuff mark on the floor. Not a footprint, not a drag mark, not even a speck of dust disturbed. The concrete was uniformly gray, undisturbed. It was wrong. I slowed down, my eyes scanning the floor. The further I walked, the more unsettling it became. It was like no one had ever walked down this hallway before. I remembered Walt's list, the one he'd handed me on my first night. Something about routes, about sticking to established paths. I couldn't quite recall the exact wording. Something about areas that hadn't been claimed. I dismissed it. It was probably just a safety precaution, a way to keep people from getting lost. This was a hospital, not a labyrinth. A service hallway. It was meant to be used. But the lack of any sign of previous passage gnawed at me. I kept walking faster now, wanting to reach the end of the hallway and get back to the familiar routine of the main floor. The sweet floral smell was getting stronger, almost cloying. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. Finally, I reached the end of the hallway. A steel door, identical to the one I'd entered through, led back into the central supply room. I practically lunged for the handle, pushed it open, and stepped back into the brightly lit, bustling space. I finished restocking the carts, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I kept glancing back toward the service access door, wondering what I'd experienced. It was just a hallway, I told myself, an unused hallway. But the pristine condition of the floor, the oppressive silence, the strange smell, it didn't feel right. I decided to log the use of the access hallway in the maintenance log, just to cover myself. Used service hallway between Station 7 and Central Supply to expedite restocking. No issues observed. It sounded reasonable, neutral. I initialed and dated it, then added a small note. Recommend investigating lack of foot traffic in this area. I didn't mention the smell. It felt silly to write that down. As I was finishing, Irene, one of the day techs, came in. She nodded at me, a weary expression on her face. "Long night?" she asked. I shrugged. Quiet. Just the usual. I didn't mention the hallway. I didn't want to sound like a nervous rookie. She glanced at my entry in the logbook. Using the service access, huh? You know Walt doesn't like people going back there? Needed to save time, I said. Just a quick shortcut. Irene raised an eyebrow. Suit yourself. Just don't say I didn't warn you. She paused. That hallway hasn't been walked in, well, a long time. At least that's what I've heard." She turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, staring at my entry in the logbook. I hadn't just taken a shortcut. I'd walked somewhere no one else had bothered to, and now I was the one who had. I was going around with a disinfectant spray, wiping down the chairs in the waiting room. It was 3 a.m., the quietest part of the shift, when everyone was deep in sleep dialysis. The rhythmic whir of the machines was comforting, actually, predictable. A white noise that filled the silence without being intrusive. I'd put on one of Sarah's playlists, mostly REM and The Cure, and was trying to remember the last time I'd actually slept a full 8 hours. Probably before the surgery, honestly. The chairs were vinyl, that sort of institutional blue that never really feels clean, no matter how much you scrub. They'd gotten a new shipment last month, supposedly more comfortable, but they still felt cold under my hands. Each one had that same faint, lingering smell of antiseptic and something else. A sweetness, maybe? Like someone had spilled juice and it had just sat there, slowly fermenting. I made a mental note to ask Trudy about it. She'd been working here for years. She knew everything about everything. I was almost finished when I noticed it. The window at the end of the waiting room, the one facing the service access hallway, had a handprint on it, on the inside. That didn't make any sense. Patients rarely looked out that window. The hallway was just a blank gray wall, and even if someone had leaned against it, the cleaning crew did a walk-through every morning. They'd have noticed. I walked closer, squinting. It was definitely a handprint. A small one, like a child's. But there were no children scheduled for overnight dialysis. It wasn't smeared or blurred, just a perfect, clear imprint, as if someone had pressed their palm against the glass a few minutes ago. I ran my own hand over the outside of the window, checking for a corresponding print. Nothing, just the cool, smooth glass. It had to be a trick of the light, maybe, or a residue from the cleaning solution. I was probably just tired, starting to see things. Then I remembered the document. The one I'd read on my first day, buried in the employee handbook. Something about reflective surfaces, about not touching them after a certain hour. It wasn't a clear memory, more of a feeling, a warning about contamination, and something about covering marks. I couldn't recall the exact phrasing, but the gist was there. Don't touch, and if there's already something there, conceal it. It felt ridiculous, superstitious, but after everything with Winnie, and with Walt's warning about the hallway, and the whole mess with staying late, I wasn't willing to risk it. It was probably just a smudge, a cleaning crew oversight. But the way the handprint stood out, so sharply defined against the gray hallway, visible through the glass, it felt intentional, like someone or something was trying to leave a message, a ridiculous thought. I needed coffee, a strong one. I dismissed it, just fatigue. I went to the supply closet and grabbed a stack of the paper patient bibs. They were flimsy, but it was all I had. Carefully, I smoothed one over the handprint, taping it securely to the glass. It covered it completely, obscuring the shape, making the window just a solid, opaque surface. I stepped back, studying my work. It looked wrong, like a bandage on a wound. I glanced at the clock. It was 3:17 a.m. The designated hour had passed. Whatever that rule was about, I'd followed it. I'd covered the mark. I'd avoided contact. I should feel better. But I didn't. As I turned away, I caught a glimpse of something in my peripheral vision. A movement, not outside the window, in the hallway, but within the reflection. I stopped, frozen. I didn't dare turn my head. I didn't dare look directly at the window. I just felt it. Something was there, mimicking my own stillness. A shape, vaguely humanoid but distorted, stretched and wavering like a heat mirage. It wasn't a clear image, just a disruption of the reflection, a shadow that didn't belong to me or to anything in the room. It lingered for only a moment, then faded, leaving the reflection smooth and undisturbed. But the feeling remained, a cold prickling sensation on the back of my neck. I forced myself to breathe, to tell myself it was a trick of the eye, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion, but I knew with a sickening certainty that it hadn't been. I finished wiping down the chairs, my movements jerky and uncoordinated. I avoided looking at the window, focusing on the chipped vinyl and the lingering scent of disinfectant. The music, which had been comforting just moments before, now sounded tinny and hollow. I needed to get through the next few hours, to make it to sunrise, to get home to Sarah and the kids. I checked the dialysis machines, making sure all the lines were secure, the fluid levels were stable. Everything was normal, everything was as it should be, except for the window. And the feeling that something was watching me, even now from the other side of the glass. I kept my back to it, making my rounds. I didn't look again, but I knew with a growing dread that whatever had been there wasn't gone. It was just waiting. And I had a feeling it wouldn't be long before I saw it again. I have to remember to ask Trudy if there's a different cleaning solution we can use. Something stronger. Something that can actually clean things. The smell of ammonia was strongest in the charting room. It wasn't the harsh, stinging smell of pure ammonia, more like a lingering residue from whatever floor cleaner Irene used. She was meticulous, Irene, always had been. I preferred the overnight shift precisely because she wasn't here. Not that she was unpleasant, just efficient, and her efficiency always made me feel slow. I was sorting through the patient charts, filing the completed dialysis reports. It was a mindless task, but it gave me something to do, something to focus on besides the quiet, and the shadows, and the feeling that I was being watched. Most of the charts were neatly organized, color-coded by patient. But there was a small stack of older reports, from last fall, that hadn't been filed yet. They were tucked away in the bottom of the cabinet, almost hidden. I pulled them out, intending to get them sorted. The paper felt brittle, yellowed with age. I started flipping through them, checking for any missing information. Most were standard, routine. Then I came across one that was different. It was a report for a patient named Rand, dated November 14th. The handwriting was familiar. Trudy's. But something was off. There was a thick black line scribbled across a portion of the notes, almost completely obscuring the writing underneath. It wasn't a neat line either. It was jagged, frantic, like someone had attacked the paper with a pen. Beneath the black ink, I could just barely make out the ghost of words, faded and smudged. I held the chart up to the light, squinting, trying to decipher what had been written. It was frustratingly close, almost readable. I could make out a few letters, a fragment of a phrase, something about a pressure reading, but the ink was too faded, the line too heavy. It was probably just a mistake. Trudy was usually so careful. Maybe she'd spilled coffee or gotten frustrated with the patient and impulsively crossed something out. It didn't matter. The important information was still there. The vital signs were clearly recorded. I should just file it and move on, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deliberately hidden. The way the ink was applied, the sheer force of it, it didn't seem like a simple correction. Then I remembered something Trudy had said a few weeks ago, during my first week. Something about the logs, about what to do if you found an entry that had been altered. It wasn't a clear instruction, more of a vague warning, something about not trying to read what was underneath, not asking questions, just noting it and moving on. I couldn't recall the exact phrasing, just a nagging impression of caution, a sense that some things were better left undisturbed. I lowered the chart, my hand trembling slightly. It wasn't a tremor, exactly. More like a persistent vibration, a buzzing sensation in my fingertips. I forced myself to take a deep breath. It was just a crossed-out note, nothing to worry about. I reached for the logbook, a thick spiral-bound volume where we recorded any unusual occurrences. I flipped to the current page, and with a ballpoint pen, I wrote, "Patient Rand's chart, dated 11/14. Erased entry noted. Location, chart cabinet, section B. No attempt made to read original." It felt oddly satisfying, writing it down, like acknowledging a debt, acknowledging a presence. I closed the logbook, my hand lingering on the cover for a moment. The ammonia smell seemed to have intensified, filling the room with a cloying sweetness. I didn't look at the chart again. I carefully placed it back in the cabinet, tucking it away among the other files. I double-checked the lock on the cabinet. It clicked shut with a solid, reassuring sound. But even as I turned away, I knew it wasn't about the lock. It wasn't about keeping anyone out. It was about keeping something in. I glanced at the clock. 4:53 a.m. Still a long way to go. I needed to get back to the dialysis floor to make my rounds. But as I walked towards the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd left something behind in that room. Not a physical object, but a question, a silence. And I had a growing suspicion that the answer to that question was something I didn't want to know. I made a mental note to ask Trudy about the chart cabinet lock. It seemed a little loose. I was restocking the supply closet off the main corridor. Mostly just paper towels, disinfectant wipes, those little alcohol swabs they use before the needle sticks. Tedious work, but it had to be done. Irene was usually on top of it, but she'd called out sick yesterday with a migraine, and it was falling behind. The closet was surprisingly warm, stuffy even, despite the center's usual chill. The heating system was ancient, always oscillating between freezing and tropical. The overhead fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, casting long, distorted shadows. I tried to ignore it. I'd mentioned it to Cal during the handover, and he just shrugged and said it was part of the charm. Cal said a lot of things, mostly things designed to avoid actual work. I pulled a box of nitrile gloves off the shelf, stacking them neatly beside the hand sanitizer. The smell of latex was strong, almost medicinal. It reminded me of the hospital of the week Sarah spent in intensive care. I was tracing the expiration dates on the alcohol swabs when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I reached for it, a little annoyed. It was a text from Sarah, just checking in, she said. Making sure I hadn't fallen asleep on my feet, I smiled. She worried too much. I typed a quick reply telling her everything was quiet, just restocking supplies. And that's when I stopped, right there in the middle of the corridor. I hadn't even realized I'd stopped. The text message had pulled my attention, and I just paused. I was halfway between the supply closet and the nurse's station, right in the center of the long hallway. It wasn't a conscious decision. I just wasn't moving. The lights at the far end of the corridor began to go out. Not all at once, but one by one. A slow, deliberate extinguishing. First the one above the break room, then the one near the dialysis machines, then the one by the staff entrance. Each flicker and dimming felt intentional, like someone was systematically cutting the power. It was probably just a faulty circuit. The building was old, the electrical system notoriously unreliable. Cal had mentioned something about a planned maintenance check next week. It didn't mean anything, I just needed to keep walking. It wasn't a big deal, I told myself. Just a coincidence. But then I remembered something. A fragment of a conversation, something Trudy had said during my initial training. It wasn't a specific rule, not like the chart regulations or the hallway restrictions. It was just advice. Something about that corridor, about keeping moving, about not stopping, even for a second. She'd said something about the flow, about how the space didn't like to be interrupted. It was vague, almost superstitious. I hadn't paid much attention at the time. I'd figured she was just trying to scare the new guy. But now, with the lights blinking out like dying embers, it didn't seem so silly. I needed to get to the nurse's station. I needed to check the security monitors. The power outage could be a sign of something more serious, a break-in maybe, or a problem with the backup generator. The patients needed to be monitored. But I couldn't move, not yet, not while I was standing still in the middle of the corridor. The memory of Trudy's words felt like a weight pressing down on me, anchoring my feet to the floor. I had to keep walking. That was it, just keep walking. I took a deliberate step forward, then another. The lights continued to go out, receding down the hallway like a wave. The corridor was growing darker, the shadows lengthening. It felt colder now, too, a damp, creeping chill that raised gooseflesh on my arms. I forced myself to maintain a steady pace, my eyes fixed on the nurse's station. I reached the station, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The monitors were dark, the screens blank. The security system was offline. I checked the power panel, but it was showing a normal reading. Everything appeared to be functioning correctly except for the lights, and the unsettling, pervasive sense that I was being watched. I tried to access the security footage from the backup server, but it was inaccessible. A system error message flashed on the screen. I glanced back down the corridor. The last few lights had flickered and died, plunging that section into complete darkness. The ammonia smell seemed stronger now, almost overwhelming. Then I remembered Rand, his chart. The erased entry. I hadn't checked on his status before the lights went out. I hadn't even thought about him. I'd been so focused on the power outage, on the security system that I'd completely forgotten about the patient. Now, with the monitors down and the corridor shrouded in darkness, I couldn't remember which bay he was in. I couldn't even be sure if he was still connected to the machine. A wave of nausea washed over me. I had a sudden, sickening feeling that I'd made a terrible mistake. A mistake that could have serious consequences. I needed to check on Ines. She'd been having a rough time with her potassium levels all week, and the power outage hadn't helped. The machines were all running on battery backup, but it wasn't the same. She was prone to cramping, and the fluctuations could be dangerous. I grabbed a fresh cup of coffee, weak, lukewarm, but still, and headed toward Bay 5. It was on the other side of the main monitoring room, past the storage closet and the break room. A fairly straightforward walk. The emergency lights cast everything in a sickly green hue. It made the linoleum floor look like a swamp. I tried to focus on the task at hand, on Ines. She was a sweet woman, always thanking me for just being there. She'd told me about her grandkids, her garden, her collection of ceramic birds. Small talk, mostly, but it made the long nights feel a little less isolating. I passed the break room, the scent of stale coffee and bleach mixing in the air. Nobody ever bothered cleaning it properly. As I walked past the storage closet, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. It shouldn't have been. Trudy was meticulous about security. Everything had to be locked, even during operating hours. I hesitated for a second, probably just the power surge, maybe the door hadn't latched properly. But I glanced inside anyway. It was dark, of course, filled with stacks of boxes and spare equipment. Nothing seemed out of place. I was being ridiculous, letting my nerves get the best of me. But then I remembered something. A note on the map, a small, handwritten addition. It was almost hidden, tucked into the corner near the utility room. I'd seen it during my initial orientation but hadn't paid much attention. Something about a restricted area, a zone that was off-limits to all personnel. I couldn't recall the exact wording, but I remembered the sense of finality. A stark, black line circling a section of the building. A warning. It was on the far side of the storage room, a short hallway leading to what I now remembered being labeled archives. It was a small section, just a few offices and a larger room. I'd assumed it was just old patient records, administrative files, probably dusty and boring. But the map had marked it with a thick red X, and now, seeing the storage closet door slightly open, the hallway seemed closer, more accessible. It was a direct route to Ines Bay if I cut through. A shortcut. I dismissed it immediately. It was just an old storage area. Trudy was probably just overly cautious. I was wasting time. Ines needed me. I started to step toward the open closet door, intending to take the shortcut. It would save me at least 1 minute. That's when I smelled it. Not the bleach, not the coffee, something else. Something acrid and metallic, like old pennies mixed with dust. It was faint, barely perceptible, but it was enough to stop me dead in my tracks. It wasn't coming from the storage closet. It was coming from the hallway beyond. From the archives. I stood there for a moment, my hand hovering near the doorframe. The smell was getting stronger now, filling my nostrils with a coppery tang. It made the back of my throat ache. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the light, a lingering effect of the power outage. I was tired, stressed, and probably dehydrated. My sinuses were just acting up, but the smell persisted, growing more intense with each passing second. Then, I heard it. A faint scraping sound coming from the end of the hallway, like something being dragged across the floor. It was barely audible, but it was definitely there. It wasn't the sound of equipment or of anyone walking. It was different, rough, uneven, and disturbingly slow. I backed away from the storage closet. Slowly, deliberately. I didn't turn around, didn't want to see what might be lurking in the darkness. I just wanted to get away, to put some distance between myself and that hallway. I walked quickly, almost jogging, back toward the main monitoring room, ignoring Ines for a moment, focusing only on escaping the smell and the sound. I checked on Ines, of course. She was stable, a little anxious, but otherwise okay. Her machine was functioning properly. I apologized for the delay, explaining about the power outage. She smiled and squeezed my hand. "Don't worry, dear," she said. "You're doing a good job." But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd narrowly avoided something. Something unpleasant. Something wrong. I kept glancing back toward the storage closet, toward the archives, wondering what was behind that door, wondering what made that smell, wondering what made that sound. I made a note in the log documenting the power outage and the status of all the patients. I didn't mention the smell. I didn't mention the sound. I didn't mention the hallway. I didn't mention the red X on the map. I didn't mention anything at all. I just wrote the facts, and then I added a new entry, a specific note for myself. Avoid the archives, no matter what. I had a feeling I would need to remember that. I was restocking the supply cart, mostly saline solution and alcohol wipes. It's a tedious job, but it gets me moving and keeps me from staring at the monitors for too long. The overnight shifts are always slow. Most of the patients are asleep, machines humming a constant, monotonous tune. Irene was on patient rounds, checking lines and vitals. I hadn't seen anyone else since Walt clocked out at 11. The cart was getting heavy. I'd filled it with everything we'd need for the next few hours. The new shipment of blood tubing hadn't arrived yet, but that wasn't my concern. My back was starting to ache, the linoleum floor cold under the thin soles of my shoes. I was thinking about making another pot of coffee, maybe listening to some of Ren's playlist. She always had a good mix of classic rock when I heard the elevator doors open. That was strange. The elevator wasn't scheduled for use after 11. It's only supposed to be used for incoming patients or emergency transport. And it was definitely open. I could hear the faint whir of the motor settling, then silence. I glanced up, expecting to see someone. Maybe Walt had forgotten something. But the hallway was empty. It was probably just a glitch. The old building, the electrical system. It wasn't surprising that things malfunctioned from time to time. I'd filed a maintenance request about the flickering lights in the East Wing last week and still hadn't heard anything back. It was probably just a sensor issue, the elevator thinking someone had called it from an empty floor. A minor inconvenience, nothing more. I continued restocking the cart, trying to ignore the lingering feeling that something wasn't right. But then I remembered a fragment of something I'd read during orientation, buried in a stack of policies and procedures. Something about the elevator, something about facing the other way. It wasn't clear in my memory, just a vague impression of a rule. Something about after a certain hour, 2 a.m., maybe you were supposed to ride the elevator facing the doors and never, ever turn around. I couldn't recall the specifics, the reasoning, the exact wording. It felt more like a warning than a regulation. I dismissed it as quickly as it came. It was a ridiculous rule. Probably something old and outdated, a holdover from a time when the building was even more rundown than it was now. The elevator was modern enough, equipped with safety features. It wouldn't just spit something out. I'd gotten spooked by the archives, and now I was projecting that anxiety onto everything. But I'd also remembered Winnie's name attached to a lot of those old rules. And the way Trudy spoke about it, that things happen here tone. The sound of the doors had been wrong too, a little slower than usual. The doors opened again, this time closer, just down the hall beyond the nurse's station. It wasn't a scheduled stop, and I hadn't heard anyone call for it. It was just opening, waiting. I froze, halfway through loading a box of gloves onto the cart. My fingers felt numb, the cardboard rough against my skin. I hadn't moved in what felt like a minute. The air in the room seemed to thicken, becoming heavy and still. My pulse did something odd, not a rush or a hammering, but a slow, rhythmic thump in my ears, like a muffled drumbeat. I knew, without a doubt, that if I turned around, if I looked toward the elevator, I shouldn't expect to see nothing. I didn't think, I didn't analyze, I didn't try to rationalize, I just acted. I bent down, grabbed the handle of the supply cart and started walking, away from the elevator, away from the open doors, away from whatever might be waiting inside. I walked quickly, almost at a run, toward the break room. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I focused on putting one foot in front of the other, on keeping my breathing steady, on pretending that everything was normal. I made a pot of coffee, black, strong, and bitter. I didn't bother with sugar or cream. I needed something to shock me awake, to ground me in reality. I sat at the small table in the break room, nursing the hot mug, listening to the hum of the machines and the distant whir of the elevator. The doors hadn't closed. The doors hadn't closed, and I hadn't looked. I'd walked away. I finished the coffee, the heat burning a path down my throat. I had a full 6 hours left on my shift, and I had a feeling it was going to be a very long night. I made a note in the log: elevator malfunction. Unscheduled stops avoid if possible. I didn't mention the rule. I didn't mention my fear. I didn't mention what I hadn't seen. I just wanted it recorded that something was off. I also made a separate, private note in my phone. A single line: always face forward. I had the unsettling feeling that I would need to remember that too. I was restocking the saline solution in the supply closet off the main nursing station. It's a small space, barely big enough to turn around in, packed with boxes and shelves. The smell in there is always the same: a sterile, slightly sweet odor that clings to the back of your throat. I was organizing by expiration date, pulling the older boxes forward, when I heard the click of the time clock. It was nearly 11, shift change. I didn't bother straightening up. It wasn't worth the effort. Trudy usually came in right on time, but she was always a little rushed. She worked a second job at the diner down on Elm Street and was perpetually apologetic about smelling like bacon grease. I could already hear the jingle of her keys in the hallway. She appeared in the doorway, and I almost dropped a box. It wasn't the smell of bacon. It wasn't anything I could place. Exactly. More like a dullness, a fading, like a photograph left in the sun for too long. It wasn't unpleasant, not exactly, just wrong. Trudy always had a flush to her cheeks, even in the cool air conditioning. Tonight, her face was pale, almost translucent. Her hands were shaking as she swiped her card at the clock. They weren't a quick tremor, but a deep, visible vibration that ran up her arms. I tried to tell myself it was just exhaustion. She was a single mom, juggling 2 jobs. The overnight shift was brutal for everyone. It messed with your sleep schedule, your appetite, your head. I'd been telling myself that for the last week, trying to normalize the general air of depletion that seemed to hang over everyone who worked here. "Rough night?" I asked, trying for a casual tone. She didn't answer right away. She was fumbling with the keyring, dropping one of the larger keys onto the linoleum with a clatter. It took her 30 seconds to gather them up, her fingers clumsy and uncoordinated. Finally, she looked up, her eyes red-rimmed, but she didn't meet my gaze. That's when it hit me. The reason for the trembling, the pallor, the way she avoided eye contact. I remembered reading something in the orientation packet, something about the outgoing technician. It wasn't a formal rule, exactly, more of a guideline, a warning, something about not asking why they looked the way they did. Just take the keys, say the phrase, start the shift. I couldn't recall the exact wording. It felt like a half-remembered dream, something I'd skimmed over and dismissed as overly cautious. But now, looking at Trudy, I understood. Whatever happened during the night, whatever they saw or experienced, it wasn't something they were allowed to share. It wasn't something you should ask about. You just accepted it. I quickly pushed the thought away. It was ridiculous. An overreaction. Trudy probably just had a bad day, a fight with her kid, a bill she couldn't pay. Thinking about my own mounting medical debt, I felt a wave of sympathy. "Here," I said, reaching for the keys. "Let me get those." She practically threw them at me. They were cold, heavier than I expected. As I caught them, her lips moved, forming the words without any real sound. "Have a good one." The departure phrase. It wasn't a friendly farewell. It was a transaction, a handover, a silent acknowledgement of something unspoken. I nodded, forcing a smile. "You too." She didn't respond. She just turned and walked away. Her shoulders slumped, her steps slow and deliberate. She didn't look back, and I didn't follow. I stood there in the doorway of the supply closet, watching her disappear down the hallway, the jingle of her keys fading with each step. As she rounded the corner, I noticed something. It was faint, almost imperceptible. A ripple, like heat rising off asphalt, distorting the air where she'd been standing. It wasn't visible directly, but I saw it reflected in the polished linoleum floor. A momentary shimmer, a blurring of the edges of reality, a fleeting impression of something else. It was gone in a second. I blinked, rubbing my eyes. It must have been a trick of the light, a shadow, fatigue, the endless hum of the dialysis machines playing tricks on my vision. I was letting my imagination run wild. I needed to focus. I had a shift to start. I went back into the nursing station and checked the clock. It was 11:03 p.m. I glanced at the patient charts, making a mental note of which machines needed priming. I tried to focus on the mundane details, on the practical tasks that lay ahead, but the image of that ripple, that distortion, kept flashing in my mind. I walked to the main console, logging into the system. Everything seemed normal. The machines were running smoothly, the lights were on, the air conditioning was humming. But something had shifted, something subtle, yet profound. The center felt different, emptier, somehow more exposed. I could still smell that fading scent, clinging to the air. It wasn't Trudy's bacon grease. It wasn't anything familiar. It was something else entirely, something I couldn't name. I ran a hand over my throat, feeling a sudden dryness. My tongue felt thick and coated. I needed water. I reached for the bottle I kept in my bag, unscrewed the cap, and took a long drink. The water did little to soothe the sensation. As I lowered the bottle, I noticed something on the keys I was holding, something small and dark, clinging to the brass. I brought them closer, squinting in the dim light. It wasn't dirt, it wasn't rust. It looked like dust, fine, black dust, like ash. I rubbed at it with my thumb, trying to brush it away, but it wouldn't budge. It was embedded in the metal, almost as if it were part of the key itself, and as I rubbed, I noticed the dust seemed to shift, to rearrange itself into a pattern, a shape. It took me a moment to recognize it, but when I did, a coldness settled in my stomach. It was a handprint, small, delicate, almost translucent, like a ghostly echo of a touch. I knew without being told that it hadn't been there before. I handed the keys back to Rand at the front desk. He didn't meet my eyes, he just took them, a quick swipe of the scanner, and tossed them into a plastic bin with a clatter. He was already looking at the schedule, muttering something about needing to call in a replacement for Saturday night. I didn't ask, I just didn't. The parking lot was empty except for my Corolla. The air outside tasted different than I remembered, sharper, colder. It wasn't the temperature exactly. It was the quality of the cold, like breathing in something scrubbed clean, then immediately contaminated. I unlocked the car and slid inside, adjusting the seat back slightly before starting the engine. I always adjusted the seat back on the way home, a habit from years of commuting. It usually helped with the tension in my shoulders. Tonight, it didn't. I drove slowly, sticking to the speed limit, even when traffic thinned out on the highway. It wasn't about avoiding a ticket, it was something else. I kept checking the rearview mirror, not for cars, but for, I don't know, a distortion, a shadow, anything out of place. It was stupid. I hadn't seen anything since the elevator, and even that it could have been a trick of the light, a momentary lapse in the power grid. The center was old, the wiring questionable. It made sense. I thought about Trudy, about the dust on the keys, about how she hadn't flinched when I gave them back, hadn't even asked how my shift had been. I tried to tell myself she was just tired, that she had her own things on her mind. Dialysis patients aren't exactly known for their robust energy levels, and Trudy always seemed to carry the weight of the world on her shoulders. But the image of that handprint, so clear and unsettling, wouldn't leave me alone. When I got home, the house was dark and quiet. Sarah was already asleep. I didn't bother turning on the overhead lights, just navigated by the soft glow of the hallway nightlights. I went straight to the bathroom and washed my hands, scrubbing for a long time, even after they were clean. I glanced at my reflection in the mirror. I looked older, more tired. I hadn't noticed it before. I made a cup of chamomile tea, hoping it would help me relax. I put on one of Sarah's playlists, the one she'd made for me while she was recovering. It was full of old Rem and the Cure songs, the kind of music we used to listen to in college. The music usually calmed me down, But tonight it just felt distant, like it was playing in another room. I sat on the back patio, sipping my tea and staring out at the backyard. It was a small yard, overgrown with weeds and wildflowers. We hadn't had time to work on it this year. Sarah had been busy with physical therapy, and I'd been trying to catch up on bills. The medical debt was still crushing us, even with the dialysis job, $120,000. It felt like an impossible amount. I found myself automatically checking the windows of the house, making sure they were all locked. I've always been a bit of a worrier, but it was different tonight. It wasn't a general anxiety. It was a specific awareness. An awareness of surfaces, of reflections, of the spaces between things. I couldn't explain it. I just felt it. The next day, I went to the hardware store and bought a roll of heavy-duty plastic sheeting. Sarah asked what it was for. I told her I was thinking about covering the windows during the upcoming storm. It wasn't a lie exactly. We were expecting some heavy rain, but that wasn't the real reason. I spent the afternoon meticulously covering every window in the house, taping the plastic sheeting securely to the frames. It made the rooms dark and stuffy, but it felt safer. Sarah didn't say anything, just gave me a strange look and went back to her book. Now, every time I walk into a room with windows, I pause. I don't consciously think about it. It's just a reflex, a slight hesitation before entering, a quick scan of the surfaces, a silent assessment of the light. It takes a fraction of a second, barely noticeable, but it's always there.